I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you once again this week from Toronto in Canada. In this first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the Trump presidency and the fact that he is continuing to benefit off of his presidency, something that he had promised he would not be doing before he had come into office. That's a pledge that he had made, saying that he would hand over his business interests to his sons. But of course, we know that even though that may have occurred on the outside, that Donald Trump himself personally, too, is profiting from the fact that he is president, with the Secret Service being charged, obviously, every time that he is traveling to one of his own golf resorts. And then, of course, Republicans being encouraged to use only his facilities, Trump facilities, throughout the country. And in fact, it can be argued throughout the world already, but we've seen with previous Trump cabinet ministers as well doing so also. The numbers are quite staggering. $250,000 to Trump's businesses have been paid by the Secret Service in just the first 5 months of his presidency alone. That translates to almost Trump businesses earning $2,000 a day from the Secret Service in the first 5 months of his presidency. And then, of course, there are quite a few other significant statistics to discuss as well. But overall, this goes to show that Donald Trump came into this seat knowing that he would be profiting, and that he's seen this really as a business move as well, hasn't he? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Onur, who is a president of the Dragon One Strategies. He's also a political advisor, author, and has worked previously in the White House during the Clinton administration. He's joining us now from Istanbul. Joining us from Dublin is Haley Wilson, who is an American politics and foreign policy analyst. Haley and Onur, thank you both for your time today. Haley, I'd like to start with you. Do you think it's a surprise rate? We're now seeing proof that Donald Trump is really benefiting from his position as the U.S. president.
I don't find it surprising in that it was never a mispremonition that he wasn't going to benefit from being president in some way, as most of what we've seen him do policy-wise has been somewhat self-serving in forms of tax policy, trade policy, and other things like that. But one of the ways I think we could have looked at this in the very beginning was when Melania Trump and Barron Trump wanted to live in Trump Tower, which the security detail alone was costing taxpayers $100,000 a day. And that's Trump directly benefiting from the use of Secret Service at Trump Tower. So that's pretty staggering. But also, just in 3 months, her flights and her private flight detail to fly between Washington, D.C. and Trump Tower in New York was almost $400,000, which is almost double what Michelle Obama's annual flight allowance was for private travel costs for not official business. So I don't think it's shocking. And the other thing that you have to look at is this is taxpayer money. This isn't Trump's personal funding that he's using to travel because he is the president. So that's, what the Secret Service has to do in order to protect the president, which is their mission and what their department is for. So I don't think that it's shocking. I do think it's surprising how much it seems he's profiting, because I think that everybody thought it was going to come in to be a small amount of money, but it actually is quite staggering how much money he's earning from all of his business endeavors.
So then, the argument can be made, listen, Donald Trump's a smart man. He knows what he's doing. He's always been a businessman. He saw this as a business move, and it's succeeding. I mean, isn't that what the entire system is rigged up to be? If you're smart, then you make money even as a U.S. president.
I mean, it's true, but looking at it from one side, Trump never, ever, claimed that he would not run the presidency as a company, and that he would be a CEO instead of a president. And that is exactly what he's doing. There seems to be a lot of things coming out right now that he is, it's not breaking, but stretching the laws of a president or the things a president can do. But on the other hand, I guess in today's politics, as long as you make the majority happy, you go a long way, which is exactly what Trump is doing. I mean, if you look at middle class America, which is an overwhelming majority, as it has been for a long time, they seem to be happy. At least it seems to be more people supporting him than disapproving him at this point. And as long as this keeps going, if the legal system does not put a stop to it, if there's a reason to put a stop to it, I believe he's going to continue, and I'm afraid he's not going to have much trouble getting reelected in 2020.
Yeah, and one of the things is that obviously when we talk about the legal aspect of all of this, there's the emoluments clause that's brought up a number of times, and the Democrats bring that up regularly, in fact, when it comes to Donald Trump is profiting off his position as U.S. president. Do you think that will play into this entire impeachment process, which is also occurring at the same time? I mean, do you think that will eventually become a large aspect of what may hurt Trump going forward?
I think it just depends on how Democrats want to play this impeachment. It comes down to political strategy, because there is enough to impeach Trump, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of Senate and House Democrats right now, just based on the illegal activities that took place during his phone conversations with Zelensky and his negotiations with Ukraine in exchange for information on Joe Biden. However, Democrats could decide to bring that into the impeachment inquiry. However, I don't know if it's necessarily wise, considering that although they are moving towards getting his tax returns released, that might not be the smartest way to go about it. If Democrats truly want Trump to be out of office, it might be wiser to pursue a path different than his financial records and his financial gain. Where it is very wrong, it might not be the most advantageous way for Democrats to get Trump out of office.
What do you make of that, Onur? Because, I mean, at some level, I wonder it might just be easier to prove this sort of thing, as in, financial gain while in office, and that, again, within the emoluments clause, not being allowed.
I do agree with her in some sense. First of all, let's not forget, impeachment is a process of politics. It's set and it's decided by politicians. So, of course, one would presume that the congressman would have the laws in their hand and the best interest of the people, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a political decision. And if you can't get the impeachment, if you can't get Trump impeached in time, you're just going to have a 2020 election result that will probably a history-setting result in the favor of Trump. So I do agree at the end with the statement that this may not be the best way to approach to remove Trump from the White House for a second term, because if this goes sour on the Democratic side or for the Democrats, it would be a disastrous defeat by Trump over the Democrats in 2020.
One of the arguments I imagine that can be made about Donald Trump specifically coming into office as U.S. president was that he was always a businessman. So, I mean, if we were to look at this logically too, he wouldn't be looking at this position just from the sake of serving his country. I mean, for anybody who knows Donald Trump and his history, I mean, they would know that he would be seeking to profit off this in some way or the other. So why should this then be a problem, do you think, going forward? Why should this be a problem for any sitting U.S. president to be seeking to profit while even in office from his position?
I think we have to look at Donald Trump as just a completely different kind of president, because he made his campaign based on the fact that he was going to try to have the U.S. profit as he has. And, like my co-guest said earlier, he has always been a businessman. This is how he's profited in the past, is from his own business ventures. I don't think we should be shocked that he's following through on his campaign promise, which is to run the United States like it's one of his businesses. And, I can't really speak to the economic aspects of his businesses, but I know that they haven't fared well in the past. And the other kind of part to this is that Trump always said that he was going to try and maximize profit for the United States, but I think he really meant for himself, because this has been a self-serving presidency in some ways. But, American voters shouldn't be shocked that they're getting what they voted for. What if this is sort of the complaint that's coming out, that he's profiting? I mean, we all kind of knew that he was going to profit. We just weren't sure how. And now I think that it's clear that he's back channeling it through a method that's always made him money, which are his resorts and his hotels. And instead of getting guests to come, he's the guest who's paying that bill and footing that bill. But unfortunately, it's not him who's paying, it's the U.S. taxpayers.
Onur, it's not just about financial dealings. It's also about nepotism to an extent, right? With his daughter and sons heavily involved, even his son-in-law heavily involved in political dealings as well, and outreach to the world also to an extent, be it on the Israel-Palestine issue, for example, with Jared Kushner involved heavily in that. Tell us about why that would be problematic for a U.S. president to be exercising that sort of nepotism as well?
I mean, for everything aside, the idea itself doesn't sound good, especially for those who are, who live in the West and who have enjoyed Western democracy's way of doing things. This is something, nepotism is something that we have seen many number of times, especially in the Eastern democracies or less developed democracies, or some of the theocracies, obviously, but also some of the dictatorships. So this is something that the U.S. public has never been exposed to. But also, again, as I said, for a system where everybody believes that everything is done by the people and for the people, these acts of nepotism will never be welcomed, whether it's in a goodwill or not, or whether there is actually a good reason to appoint your son-in-law, your daughter for such a position, will never be welcomed. So it's something the public is not really used to, and the thing is also that this is something that, as I said, we see in much far less developed democracies in the East, especially.
In some ways, then, Haley, do you think that Donald Trump's presidency has hurt American democracy? Because, as I mentioned, Onur, it's not just, of course, about his financial deal. It's also just about the very in-your-face nepotism.
That's a very good question. I don't know if I would necessarily agree that Donald Trump himself has hurt American democracy, but I think that some of the processes and tactics he's implemented would not agree with traditional democracy. However, he has the right to appoint who he wants in his cabinet. They serve at the pleasure of the president. That's up to him. So if he wants to fill it with family members, that's on him. Unfortunately, it's also on the American people, because we stand and feel the effects of an unqualified member of the cabinet serving in a very important position. If he decided he wanted his daughter to be Secretary of State, I'm sure our foreign policy would be completely different. So you kind of have to look at this from another part that's not surprising. It's not totally shocking that he went down that road, because nepotism has always been, part of what he's done. He's always filled his board with family members, especially his children. So, it's up to him to do that. Unfortunately, it's just not working out for, what the American people say that they want. So, if they serve at the pleasure of the president, he's going to pick who he wants to fill his cabinet.
Onur, one other issue that comes up when we're talking about a president's financial dealings, and specifically if we're talking about Donald Trump, is the fact that many of these men, or pretty much all of these men and women who try to become U.S. president, even as candidate, need to be fairly wealthy to even want to stand to run for office. Is that also, do you think, a problematic issue in the context of the U.S., where it's really just wealthy people who get to serve the country in this way?
Well, unfortunately, it's been like that for quite a long time. I don't remember any, less fortunate serious presidential candidates, at least in the last 30, 40 years. But yeah, it is a problem. It's going to be a more felt problem, because the world is not the way it used to be. 40 years ago, we believed the world was made up of what we saw on TV and what we read on papers, or what we saw in the movies. Today, even in the remote corner of the world, even the smallest news that would not be on the regular media outlets is literally around the world in seconds. So people are now more aware. I think people are more aware of what they can do and what they need to do, or what to do when they need to get a message across. I think it's becoming more of a issue for people that are less fortunate financially to move up in the ranks, right, in politics worldwide, let alone the U.S. presidency.
Very well. We'll leave that as our final comment. But of course, we do appreciate both Onur Erim and Haley Wilson for their time today, and of course, for sharing their insight with us on this topic of Donald Trump, profiting off his presidency. He's made, of course, no, he's not apologized for that situation, I don't think, although he had, of course, pledged that he would not be profiting off his businesses. He would hand it over to his sons, which on the outset, of course, he has done. But nevertheless, it is the Trump brand. It's the Trump resorts, etc., that continue to benefit off of this presidency, as Haley there had listed. Just this is all taxpayers' money at the end of the day that is going towards paying Donald Trump for being president. Not through, of course, just the salary that he gets for being president, but beyond that, of course, much more beyond that, just for the travel for his family, his own golf trips, etc. Is this ethical? Is this ethical practice for a U.S. president to be entering into? And at a time, of course, where he's supposed to be serving the country. That's why he's being voted into office. At least that's what's on paper about why the American people would want him in that seat in the White House. Well, of course, keep a close eye on this because the numbers are staggering. And it's said that, of course, these numbers will only grow if they remain consistent at this time about what the Secret Service is paying Donald Trump to protect him. I'll be back here with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss in this segment European Union aid as given to countries around the world. A new study has shown that levels of assistance from the EU to poor countries around the world has in fact dropped for a second year in a row. Now, this is not probably the most important aspect of all this, but in fact, the study also points out that less than 10% of the aid given by the EU reach the world's poorest countries, while much of the funds never even leave the EU. There's also some criticism that more than half of the development contracts are awarded to firms in the donor country itself. That last part is probably the most problematic, isn't it? Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined by Gunter Walzenbach, I should say, who's senior lecturer in European politics at the University of England. He's joining us now from Bristol in the UK. Gunter, thank you for your time today. What do you make of aid industry as, of course, based in the European Union and its role around the world?
Yes, I would say that it is worrying, but development policy has always been a very complex and difficult policy area. So I would not outright say that this is necessarily a failure just of all the consultants and the aid industry as such, but there is really a multiplicity of factors that can potentially influence the effectiveness and distribution of aid. These are long-standing issues and problems and topics that have been discussed for decades. So I wouldn't, I don't think that you can pass the blame just on one segment or one set of actors in the development process. There are good development consultants and there are bad ones. And I think it is probably a mixed picture. But there are other factors, and often the argument is made that you would have to look on a case-by-case basis very much into specific individual development projects to identify what went wrong precisely, whether it is a failure on part of the donors or whether it is a failure on part of the recipient countries, for example. So it is a very complex arrangement, and passing the blame just to one set of actors, I would be careful with.
But the big thing is, Gunter, I imagine that for all of us around the world, when we're talking about the kinds of money that we're talking about, so we're talking about, for example, the EU and its member states, who are to their credit, the biggest development donor group in the world. They invested around 71.9 billion pounds, or euros, I should say, pardon me, in 2018, more than half of global aid. When you're talking about such staggering numbers, but then when the statistics say that not all of that, or not a lot of that, in fact, I should say, is even getting to those it's intended for, then one really questions who is making money off of this. As you said, of course, there are many factors, but if you could just, expand on that for us, what do you think is the biggest factor on why this money isn't actually reaching those it's intended for, even though there's so much of it seemingly?
Well, I mean, again, a number of factors here. First of all, you have to realize that the EU is distributing aid money as an organization, but there's also development policy by the individual member states. So there is a kind of a dual structure in place. And when you say it is the biggest aid donor worldwide, that refers to the combined picture. That is the development aid given by individual member states, as well as the money that is given by collective funds of the European Union as a whole. But the priorities of these different funds are often quite different. So one of the reasons why the donor countries make big pledges, but then cannot deliver on them, has to do with the fact that in the coordination process of development aid, there are different interests involved. So you have, on the one hand, the development policy of individual member states who sometimes are former colonial powers. On the other hand, you have the development policy of the European Union as a whole. And as you know, that policy is also supposed to fit into a more global development policy that includes the United Nations, Sustainable Development Goals, and things like that. So one of the reasons is that this consistency, or the different actors involved, very often cannot get their act together. So they have different priorities. And if, for example, an aid application does not fit all those different priorities, it might well be that a respective project or a respective aid proposal will not be implemented. There are huge, on the other hand, also huge implementation problems. That is on the part of the developing countries. So that is what I meant when I said that there is, no single set of actors to blame. I would say you also have to realize that specifically the poorest of the poor have implementation problems insofar as they do not have the capacity. It doesn't make sense to simply throw big amounts of money into a particular place if nothing happens with it, or if it is just used for, prestigious projects which have no development impact. So it's a double-edged sword, and that is also part of the explanation.
Do you think also at a certain level, even though the aid has dropped for a second year running, it's still, as I said, a huge amount of money that the EU gives to its credit. Of course, as you said correctly, of course, this is, of course, a combined amount that all EU member states give individually, being combined, I should say. Do you think that in some ways aid is also used as a political tool sometimes around the world, where it's almost also a foreign policy arm of the EU bloc?
Well, the EU tries to use it as a foreign policy arm in the sense to connect and to make development aid conditional on ideas such as good governance and the rule of law, which in principle, I think, or humanitarian objectives, which in principle are good ideas. On the other hand, of course, very often the member states are closer to specific foreign policy interests. I mean, in recent years, you have, for example, seen that ideas connected with reducing the push factor of migration has to do with economic development. So individual countries have particularly fostered projects of that nature. Or if you think about the connection with environmental policy. So in the academic literature, you will find that the usual argument is that you find much more foreign policy interests and national interests, and the so-called tying of aid to national interests at the level of individual countries and their foreign policy process. Whereas at the EU level, the decision-making is less politicized, and therefore genuine humanitarian factors, ideas around good governance, rule of law, sustainable development, also local ownership, have a bigger say in that kind of environment.
Do you think there's some level of a deficit of trust almost in some aid groups around the world, considering, as you well know, of course, there have been scandals, even at the United Nations, of mismanagement, financial mismanagement included, nepotism, corruption, etc., even within, quote unquote, projects that were meant for aid. Do you think that sort of concern needs to be dealt with at some level, even in the EU?
Of course, that is a major concern. And you have to realize that the priorities of government agencies and the priorities of non-governmental agencies that work in the aid sector are not necessarily, perfectly aligned. There are quite different aims and objectives, but I think the scandals that occurred in recent years have again highlighted that in this whole distribution process of aid money, you have to be very careful. That is certainly also the case for the EU, because the EU depends in terms of implementation of projects in the poorest developing countries absolutely on non-governmental organizations, and all these projects are done by a multiplicity of actors, from academia, aid workers on the ground, local professionals, and so on and so forth. But of course, in turn, that requires also a lot of more bureaucracy, background checks of the people involved, their expertise, and so on, which in itself might lead to a result that in the end a certain project can simply not go ahead.
Let's add another voice to this conversation. We're also not joined by Iván Farías Pelcastre, who is a PhD in political science and international studies from the University of Birmingham. He's joining us now from Warsaw in Poland. Iván, as always, thank you for your time, for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of the aid industry, Iván, as you may have observed it from there in Europe? What do you make of its intentions? Of course, Europe, as I put to our other guests as well, according to statistics, is the largest donor group as a whole when we're adding up all the donations from the countries that make up the EU. But then, of course, those numbers are dropping. The donor countries, firms are the ones that get the contracts, etc. So somebody within the EU itself is benefiting a lot from this, aren't they?
Yes, I would agree that the EU does a great work when it comes to providing aid in terms of short-term emergencies. We have to remember that the EU provides two kinds of support, short-term and long-term. Short-term when it comes to these natural disasters, for example, and long-term when it comes to promoting development. In my perception, the EU does a very good job when it comes to short-term aid, providing lab life support, for example, sending medical doctors to areas of disaster. The problem that lies at the core of international aid, however, is when it comes to long-term promotion of development. In many cases, including that of the EU, most of the aid that is provided comes, yes, also with financial ties, especially to providers and contractors in the home countries, in the supporting countries, sorry. So I think that's the issue that has to be taken into account. We have to divide aid into two kinds of tiers, and the EU does a very bad job when it comes to long-term promotion of development.
You know, one of the arguments I imagine that can be made, Iván, is that for many of those people who work in the aid industry, they need to somehow be able to pay, of course, their own employees, for example, or there needs to be, the finances need to work out somehow. How does one, do you think, or how is it even possible for one to be able to give aid with the best of intentions, but yet be able to pay their own employees? Because if we're looking at the numbers again, and this has been an issue for the aid industry around the world, certainly, that you have to pay employees, so then you use a lot of the money that comes in from donations for that. And many of the times the percentages work out such that what you end up happening is less percentages going to actual aid work. That is also troubling at some level, isn't it?
It is. One of the issues that could resolve some of the underlying problems of EU aid could be technology transfer when it comes to providing funds for development. For example, when it comes to solar photovoltaic cells, these technologies, if they were provided to middle income as well as poor countries.
Gunter, what do you make of, again, the percentages work out? And I'm talking, of course, as a whole now about the aid industry and your observations of it, because as I put to Iván as well, it's about the percentages here, right? And then, of course, the public perception at times, I imagine, if you look at percentages where less of the percentage of the money that's coming in is actually going to those most deserving of it, That sort of just defies logic sometimes, doesn't it?
It defies sometimes logic, but as I said earlier, the best way to look into that problem would be to proceed on more of a case-by-case analysis. If you look into, for example, World Bank statistics and reports of them, they have, for example, internal audits. They have independent experts to assess their policy effectiveness, and they do, for example, claim that 3 out of 4 development projects are actually successful. So it is true, there is a whole industry of consultancies, of experts who make a living out of that policy sector. And I'm also sure that a lot of work can be done to improve the performance, the effectiveness, to introduce best practices and things like that. But at the same time, if you take the figures, you also have to keep in mind that development aid is planned 4 to 5 years ahead. I mean, that is what the earlier speaker said in terms of long-term planning. We also had, a financial crisis. We now have looming Brexit, where, for example, EU donors know that there will be less money in the system. So they will probably already be more careful in distributing that money.
Ivan, I wanted to get your concluding remarks before we end this segment. What are your thoughts about how we can then deal with the aspect that I brought up with you about how the percentages work out, about how money is then distributed to those who are actually most deserving?
It's always a complicated issue. I think one of the ways in which the EU could be doing a much better job would be using local resources. Sometimes, as it has been mentioned, there are many agencies which commit their entire work to getting EU development contracts. While this, enables a specialization, it also ties most of the money to the same agencies and the same companies. So it would be much better to provide those funds directly to the countries, and also to enable development within the country by hiring local resources. Yes, this will enable them to improve their skills, as well as to getting to the learning curve into managing European development aid.
Very well. That is our final word. But of course, we appreciate both Ivan and Gunter for their time today, and of course, for putting this issue into context for us. Because the issue of aid anywhere in the world is, in fact, a very complicated one. And we went through some of the factors there. But the report that we were discussing specifically was a study which shows that EU aid has, in fact, dropped for 2 years in a row. And the more troubling development on that is then again that more than half of the development contracts are awarded to firms in the donor country, i.e. the country that is actually giving the money. So somebody within the country that's giving the money, in fact, is benefiting from this entire process financially to begin with. So then that sometimes in people's minds, I'm sure, brings up the question of who's really benefiting in this case. Is it actually those who are most deserving, or is it just people making money off of aid itself? I'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in the show here in Scope. We'll be back with our next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's program, we're going to discuss Sri Lanka and the elections that have just passed by there, with the win now of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and what this could mean for the country's Muslims specifically. And this, of course, coming in the context of those Easter Sunday bombings that have taken place in Sri Lanka. In the wake of those bombings, there has been an anti-Muslim wave of violence and sentiment throughout the country, on the part of the majority Sinhalese for this population. And of course, riding upon that wave was Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who has now won, as I said, these elections. And of course, this is bringing concerns then about what now happens going forward for this very strong Muslim minority in that country. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Hijrah Saputra, who is former president of Hull University Islamic Society. He's also associated with the Hull Mosque and Islamic Center, joining us now from Kingston upon Hull in the UK. Hijrah, thank you very much for joining us here in Scope. Is it concerned, do you think, this win of Gotabaya Rajapaksa and what his sentiments are towards Muslims in the country?
To know this information about the new policy of the new president in Sri Lanka, to use the issue of anti-Muslim to win the vote, it's sorry to say it's shameful. I expect that the whole leader in within the globe, that we need to stand together to resolve this issue, to stand together against the issue of terrorism. And then I believe that all of us agree that terrorism has nothing to do with any religion and any faith. We shouldn't blame like a Muslim to be as a victim, to be blamed for what happens, because of very small, group of. I believe they are having a wrong understanding of Islam, because Islam totally, absolutely does not teach their follower to do these kind of things. Even Islam's against this kind of action. So we need to stand together. We need to understand together that these actions, or the bombing and things, it has nothing to do with any religion. Even for Muslim, we totally understand that if, for example, there is a terrorism action and then the actor is the non-Muslim, for example, the other faith, whether the Christian, whether the Hindu, whether the Buddhist, whoever, the Muslim always not blamed their religion because of what they are doing. And then to blame Muslim, to be a victim, and then need to be responsible, that's really not fair. And then with this political policy to abuse this situation to win the vote, I think it will make the conditions, to resolve the peace around the world will be getting worse, in my point of view.
Indeed. So when we talk about Hijrah, the role of politicians in creating more hatred. And we've seen this happening around the world. So it's not just Sri Lanka, of course. We're seeing this in many places around the world where hatred is growing. Even Islamophobia is growing as well. We recently saw that video coming out of Australia where that pregnant Muslim woman was attacked in a cafe in Sydney. These are all very disturbing trends, aren't they?
So that's why the role of politicians, they should understand that every single policy of what they make should bring a peace, should resolve the situation, should decrease the tension. So they need to understand that they shouldn't make the reactions, to get this condition getting worse. So with the role of politician or leader, they should calm down the situation, and then they should follow the rules. I mean, the law. If there is action like that, what's the role of the country should be implemented and things. So politician has a very important role to make the situation calm down. Not to provoke the other problems, because some Muslim as well, they are easily to be provoked. But this is why all the leader, or especially in Muslim country, they need to make calm all the Muslims, and then understand that we need to stand together against the terrorism, against any actions that showing Islamophobia and or anti-Muslim or racism or hatred, something like this.
Right. So I wonder, Hijrah, when we're talking about the Muslim role in all of this, what do you think the Muslims, for example, in a place like Sri Lanka, need to do at such times?
Well, for our brothers and sisters in Sri Lanka, for the Muslim there, they need to be careful because the situation is getting worse. Probably they experience this, and then they need to to show the mercy of Islam, peace and mercy, even though they are being insulted, humiliated. Our beloved Prophet ﷺ teach us the message of mercy. Whatever the bad things the non-Muslim do, as much as we can, we show them the peace and mercy of Islam. That's the way.
Okay, so let me add to the voice of the conversation, Hijrah. I do apologize for interrupting you. We're also now joined by Chandima, who is a Sri Lankan politician and a member of the Parliament of Sri Lanka. He's joining us now from Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. Chandima, thank you for your time and for joining us here in Scope. What are your thoughts about concerns about what Muslims will be treated like now that Gotabaya Rajapaksa has won the presidency at this time there in Sri Lanka? Should we all be concerned?
Now, current president handled his political campaign on anti-Muslim and anti-Tamil nationalities. Now, anyway, he has won the election. Now he has become the president of Sri Lanka with majority of 1.3 million votes. Now, most of the minority nationals are scared of this ruling, ruling, because they followed the signalist extremes, signalist Buddhist extremes. But as the opposition, UNP as a UNP MP, right? We will look after all the minority nationals, and we'll do the needful for them, and we'll get them. We'll stand by for Muslim and Tamil minority nationals and their protection and their fairness and all their rights. And also, we, as the opposition of this country, especially the United National Party, we stand for single Buddhists also. As a historical political party, we will be looking after all the nationals of this country, and we will get them all their basic rights, and we will protect their all. Basic rights.
Why have all Muslims in Sri Lanka been blamed for the Easter Sunday bombings? I mean, to blame all Muslims in Sri Lanka is unfair, is it not?
As the opposition of this country, we will get involved any problem of Muslim minority nationals of this country, and we'll try our level best to get their all the rights and their basic needs.
Perfect. There for now, but of course we do appreciate both Chandima and Hijrah for their time today, of course, for discussing this topic of Islamophobia that is growing in Sri Lanka, especially in the wake of those Easter Sunday bombings, and now with the win of Gotabaya Rajapaksa to the presidency of Sri Lanka, a man who came in really on an anti-Muslim platform there in that country is certainly worrying. With the Easter Sunday bombings, certainly those were tragic events, and they were, condemned worldwide, especially also in the Muslim world. So for the Muslim minority now, which is a very powerful minority in Sri Lanka, to now be blamed and sidelined is something that is certainly a disturbing trend for that country. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.